My Mills stormed into our house with two kids I'd never met, dropped them off without saying a word, and then told my husband and the whole family that they were my kids. But I posted the security footage of her entering my house with the kids, completely destroying her lies, because she missed a critical detail that exposed everything. I, 28 female, have been married to Ray, 30 male, for 4 years and have known him for 8. He introduced me to his family after we'd been together for 6 months. And while most of his family had liked me, his mother did not. My mother-in-law, Ruth, 56 female, has always been kind of weird around me. She doesn't like me and I've known that for a long time, but she usually just ignores me and tries not to talk to me as much as she could whenever I come by. Last week, I was home alone, and she knew that because Ray was away on a business retreat. It was one of those social detox retreats where you're not allowed to have your phones or talk to anyone else unless it's an absolute emergency. So all of us knew that we wouldn't be able to reach him for a few days. On the 4th day of his being gone, Ruth dropped by my house. And with her came 2 kids I'd never seen before. They were both under 10 years old, but didn't say a word to me for as long as they were here. In fact, saying that the Ruth dropped by would be incorrect. She rang the bell many times before I finally opened the door. Literally raged into the house with 2 kids in tow, and then left in an equally angry way just as she'd come. I tried to get her to stop so I could talk to her and get some answers about what the hell she was doing. But with no luck because she'd taken off in her car before I could ask her anything. So I was left with the 2 random kids who refused to look at me, talk to me, or even acknowledge that I was in the house with them. I tried talking to them to find out who their parents were, but they were as good as nonverbal to me, so I gave up. My first instinct had been to call CPS, but I didn't do that because I had a nagging feeling that these kids were definitely related to my husband's family somehow. I couldn't place it, but both the kids looked familiar to me for some reason while I was trying to figure out why they seem related. So that's why I didn't call CPS and instead chose to call my husband. I told the receptionist at their resort that I needed to speak to my husband urgently. And within a few minutes, I was on the phone with him explaining everything that had happened. He told me he'd be home within a few hours and hung up. So then I was alone with the kids until he came back. The resort they'd been staying in wasn't too far away from the city, and it just took him 4 hours to drive back home. For those 4 hours, those 2 kids consciously avoided looking at me. But I kept watching over them like a hawk. I didn't even go to the washroom for those 4 hours because I wasn't about to let those kids out of my sight at any cost whatsoever. As soon as Ray came back home, I took him aside and explained how the kids weren't speaking to me at all, and how strangely they'd been whispering among themselves the entire time that they'd been here, careful enough to not let me overhear a word. This was very weird and secretive behavior from 2 kids. So I was feeling very paranoid and was on the verge of calling CPS. But Ray stopped me and told me that he'd called his mother over to explain. So whatever we needed to do, we could do after we confronted Ruth. I've been trying to get through to Ruth the entire time I was at home, but she'd been ignoring all my calls. However, when Ray had called her half an hour before he reached home, she'd answered and had told him that she'd come over and explain in a while. So after around an hour, Ruth arrived once more. And this time, she had a lot of other people with her too. She'd arrived with Ray's entire family, my father-in-law, Ray's older brother, 32 male, and his wife. I didn't understand why she'd come with an army of her own, and the others looked just as surprised as I felt. Nevertheless, Ray did confront his mother and asked about the kids. The kids were in the room with us and were literally cowering in fear and nervousness. They were trying their best to make themselves smaller and less noticeable. And I could tell that it was Ruth who was having that effect on them. When Ray asked his mom whose kids these were, she said that they were mine without missing a beat. And I was like, what? Because, of course, these weren't my kids. Ray and I had decided to remain child-free for a few years. And if we change our minds later, we just adopt. That had always been the deal. So I was shocked at Ruth's allegation, and so was the rest of the family. Ray told her to cut it out because obviously we thought that she was joking. But she doubled down on what she said and started off with some completely fictional story. Apparently, 3 weeks ago, she'd been contacted by some random man who told her that I was his ex-girlfriend. I've been dating this guy for years and even had 2 kids with him during the course of our relationship. But once I got married, I cut him off and abandoned those kids as well before ghosting him. Now that he'd found me after several years of stalking, he tried to contact me, but I just blocked him again. So he'd been left with no other option but to contact my family. And that happened to be Ruth. He'd supposedly dropped the kids off at her place and she, in a fit of rage, had dropped them off at mine so that she could reveal to everyone that I'd been a cheater and a liar all along. While she was speaking, I was literally at a loss for words and just kept staring at her with my mouth wide open. And she went on concocting some nonsense. After she was done talking, she told Ray that since I already had kids now, we had to get custody of them and make sure we raised them well because the dad didn't want them anymore. Ray refused to believe her and told her to take the kids and go because he knew she'd been lying all along. But unfortunately, the rest of the family wasn't convinced. They did think that my mother-in-law was telling the truth and so insisted that we take care of them. Or maybe they did know that Ruth was lying, but just didn't want to take up the responsibility of raising two random kids. And so they were pushing them onto us. There was a lot of shouting and yelling during the argument that came next. And eventually, Ray told them that we'd keep the kids with us for just a day for their sake. But after that, if Ruth didn't come and take them, then he'd call CPS. All this time, the kids were in the room with us. But as soon as CPS was mentioned, they ran to another room and somehow managed to lock themselves in while screaming in terror that they didn't want anyone to come and take them away. My in-laws took that opportunity to leave us with the kids, and we spent the next half an hour trying to calm them down and convince them that nobody would come and take them away. They'd finally spoken to us, so at least that was an improvement. And after a while, they opened the door too, and it was clear that they'd been crying because their eyes were all red and teary. So we consoled them, put them to bed in the guest room, and went to sleep ourselves in our bedroom. We'd had a long tiring day, and we were confused as hell as to what was going on here. Ray and I didn't even talk much before going to bed because we were that tired. It was not until the next morning that Ray and I discussed what to do next with the kids. We couldn't take care of them forever because that had never been in the cards anyway. But we couldn't call CPS either because apparently, they were terrified of that idea. While we were brainstorming, Ray said something about how it would help so much if there was some proof that Ruth had brought the kids here. Finally, when he said that, I was reminded of the security footage from the cameras that I'd installed outside. In the panic and hub of the previous day, I'd completely forgotten about the security cameras and that I could actually use that footage to prove that Ruth had brought the kids here. To be honest, we've never had cause to use the cameras, so we've forgotten about them. But when Ray said that, and I remembered, we rushed to the laptop to access the camera footage. When we played it, we saw Ruth get out of her car and grab the kids. Then she marched them up to our door, and that's when something crazy happened. One of the kids tried to shake her off and make a run for it back to the car, but she grabbed him real quick once more and proceeded to shake him violently. It was the younger kid who tried to run. And when the older sibling saw him being shaken, he tried to tell Ruth to stop. But she turned around and slapped the older kid on the cheek. I gasped because the slap looked like it had hurt. And it finally made sense that they were cowering in fear when they saw Ruth in the house once more when she came by to argue with us. Ray was just as shocked as I was, and we realized that the reason that the kids hadn't been speaking had probably also been because of Ruth. She'd instructed them not to talk, and that's why they kept to themselves. We realized immediately that something fishy was going on and wanted to call the cops or CPS. But the kids' terrified faces when we mentioned them the previous day were haunting us, so we didn't. Instead, we called a friend of ours who was a cop and informed him about what was going on.